Hello wrestling fans and welcome to the WrestleReview Pilot, the first podcast of what I hope will be a fairly regular series, depending on how much I can record when I'm back at uni, looking chronologically back at classic WWE or WWF pay-per-views, depending on how corporate you are and whatever you want to call the company, during the 80s, 90s and early 2000s. So, my name is Nathan Packen, and all I can say is thanks for tuning in wherever you may be, and on whatever platform you're on, whether that be YouTube, SoundCloud, or even on iTunes. If I can actually get iTunes, if I can actually manage to post on iTunes, that would be an absolute miracle. So I'll be setting up a Twitter and Facebook page soon for the podcast. But in the meantime, if you do want to send any feedback and comments, you can to WrestleReviewFans@gmail.com. I'm going solo for this pilot episode, but I'm hoping to get some friends and some other fans involved and to take part in further reviews. But without further ado, let's get on to the subject of this pilot episode. It's the WWF on WTBS in 1984, the event known to wrestling geeks as Black Saturday. And all I can say is how very dark it is indeed. Now, before I go any further, I need to say a special thanks to the OSW podcast and also to Botchamania for inspiring me to do something like this, and also to the 411 Mania review of this show, which gave me a lot of hilarious comments and moments to focus on. So, we might as well get straight into the action here. So I'll just give you a little bit of background information on how this WWF on WTBS Black Saturday event came about on the crucial date in wrestling history of July 14th, 1984. So here's some background information for you. So basically, in 1972, Ted Turner, yes, the Ted Turner of WCW ownership, launched Georgia Championship Wrestling, a hugely successful cable show which often received the highest cable ratings each week. Success which could be put down to amazing wrestling and broadcast talent, such as the unforgettable Gordon Soley, who was basically an early JR and who JR would draw great inspiration from during his own broadcasting and commentary career. So by 1981, Georgia Championship Wrestling had become so big that it became World Championship Wrestling, which wasn't quite the same WCW as Ted Turner would come to own, although it was kind of similar because it was linked to Turner in some kind of weird case of the uncanny. This name change was an effort to make the promotion seem less regional, and meanwhile, of course, another promoter was also attempting to make his company seem less regional by buying literally everything. And of course, I'm talking about the unflappable Vincent Kennedy McMahon. By 1984, all was not well at GCW. They'd basically had a couple of writing fallings out, I think, between a man named Ole Anderson and also the Briscoe brothers, who, of course, are Jerry and Jack. And they ended up selling their majority stock of the company to the ravenous Vincent Kennedy McMahon, who quickly stole the slot in question to promote the World Wrestling Federation. So basically, there's the background information for this infamous event, and now let's talk about the event itself. So, the event starts with Freddie Miller and Vince McMahon introducing the event. So the familiar face of Gordon Soley is absolutely nowhere to be seen and is replaced by this guy called Freddie Miller, who I had to wiki to find out anything about. He welcomes Vince to the show with the World Championship Wrestling logo still in the background, just to rub salt into the wounds. And Vince makes pains here not to specifically refer to the change in talent, probably a further, fuck you to those stubborn regional bastards who were storming on his violently colonial-esque takeover of wrestling. He then leads us into match one, which is Adrian Adonis before his adorable gimmick, and Dick Murdoch against Nick DiCarlo and SG Jones. And Adonis and Murdoch are actually the tag team champions here. So this kicks off an absolute shitstorm of a show. This match appears to be taking place in something resembling close to a high school gym, with a rope around the ring separating the fans from the action. That actually is more flimsy than a mid-80s wrestling rope, which I don't know how that's even possible. And it's Vince and Tony Gurria on commentary, and they're providing characteristically monotonous commentary to this match. And to make matters even worse, before things have even begun, the nondescript announcer, of who I have absolutely no idea what his name is, if anyone does know, please do drop me a message, pronounces Adrian Adonis as Adrian Adonis, who is tag team champion with notorious racist Dick Murdoch. And of course, they're coming up against an African American and an Italian American, so this really bodes well there. SG Jones dances about a bit, as he was probably asked to do by the not so subtly racist writing team of the WWF in the 80s, and he's joined by his first time partner Nick DiCarlo, who currently doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, so it just shows you how obscure DiCarlo is, or maybe I'm being completely unfair to his legacy. So as jobbing matches goes, this is actually pretty decent stuff, with Jones and DiCarlo receiving some great reactions from the crowd, despite the lack of severity in their moves. In the end, it ends pretty quickly with a really good Adonis and Murdoch backdrop clothesline combo, kind of similar to a Legion of Doom kind of thing, on DiCarlo for the 3 count. This was actually decent enjoyment for a jobbing match, but really it's all downhill from here. So I'm going to award this match 2.5 stars out of 5, because it was your average jobbing match, but it wasn't too bad. It was half decent entertainment, despite the frankly awful setting it's in, and not exactly the best way to start a show. But there you go. It is going to get a lot worse from here on in. So then we cut to an interview which Vince introduces, with George the Animal Steel being introduced by Mr. Fuji. Okerlund tries to hype Steel as this enigma with Mr. Fuji, who tells Okerlund that only he has the power to communicate with the muted animal. Steel comes in and tries to sell this terrible mental deficiencies angle with typically offensive results. He ends up, after a hell of a long delay, I mean, it just goes on forever, by finally shouting, "Fuji!" with a little bit of goading from the racially stereotyped James Bond-esque villain. So that's the end of that frankly terrible interview. And then Vince introduces match 2, which is Jesse the Body Ventura against Chris Curtis. And all of a sudden, the arena has changed from to a slightly more expansive setting than the high school gym we were just in, to an arena in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and now Mean Gene and Gorilla Monsoon are on commentary. What's pretty funny about the beginning of this taping is that there's a notification as the body is entering that someone has left their car lights on. It kind of flashes up on the screen in the background. If you are watching the event, it's pretty clear to see. And the body enters the ring to face the jobber Chris Curtis, and he's another person who hasn't got a Wikipedia page from this event. However, apparently he has released a book recently about jobbing for 25 years. If anyone does have a copy, do give me a shout and tell me if it's any good. Jesse basically continually berates some Minnesota Vikings player in the crowd and pays little attention to the quality of the match he's actually taking part in. A couple of kicks and stomps to Curtis before Curtis eventually submits to his body breaker submission hold. I mean, this is just an absolute horror show of a bout, and I was quite disappointed because I was desperate to see kind of a pre-health problems, pre-injuries, pre-commentary Ventura in full flow. We didn't receive any of that here, of course, because he was more interested in what was going on in the crowd. This match gets a 1 star. It just about goes above the half a star for me, because Ventura is wearing some pretty cool stuff, and he gets some good pops from the crowd. But the actual quality of the match is just terrible. We cut to back to Vince, and then an interview with B. Brian Blair before his Killer Bees fame, and Alexis Smirnoff. So Mean Gene interviews Blair, who discusses his tag team partnership with another Wikipedia-less man who's called Spike Huber, before he basically jizzes over all the great talent in the WWF, and that's the end of that interview. B. Brian Blair, with his mustache, also looks like a massive porn star during this segment. And then in comes Alexis Smirnoff, who seems uncertain whether he's actually Canadian or Russian. He goes on to say something incomprehensible about cheese and his big Kazakh or Kazakh. I actually have no idea how to spell this. And this leads Mean Gene to trying to work out what his big Kuzak is. trying to avoid the obvious innuendo sniggering going on from the viewing audience. In the WWE 24/7 version, on-demand version, we then cut to an advert for the WWF magazine, but apparently in the original version there was an advert for other shows. So the WWF advertises shows in Atlanta at the Omni without actually mentioning any of the matches which are going to take place, simply advertising the show as spectacular. And then we go to this advert for the WWF magazine. So Vince takes us through an exciting advert for the WWF magazine, where all the big stars not on this show are featured. So Sergeant Slaughter visits Washington, D.C., Tito Santana surprises a young fan, not in that horrible way you're thinking, Captain Lou Albano and Cyndi Lauper team up, Hulk Hogan meets up with Johnny Carson and Brooke fucking Shields, and the fucking Samoans meet up with the fucking Mr. T, and that fucking massive fuck Andre the Giant takes us to a shitty restaurant, and all of this has no fucking relation to the show we're watching, and none of the talent from the magazine is on this clusterfuck of a show! Sorry. Just gonna move on from that. But seriously, like, just to rub salt into the wounds, there's an advert showing all the superstars you want to see who are not on the show. But in match 3, there is a man who's quite a fairly big pull at this time in the 80s, the Iron Sheik, who is accompanied by Ayatollah Freddie Blassie to face jobber Ron Hutchinson. And yes, we are back at the high school gym with McMahon and Gurria back on commentary for our 3rd squash match of this horrendous show. So we've got jobber Ron Hutchinson, who miraculously does actually have a Wikipedia page, facing the Iron Sheik and Ayatollah. Yes, you heard that right, Freddie Blassie. Sheik does his classic Iran #1 microphone hijack before destroying Hutchinson. This is a way better jobber match than the last one, with Sheik actually wrestling through the crowd chants for Sergeant Slaughter, and it's better when we compare this to Ventura's boot fest against Curtis, when he was absolutely obsessed with the Minnesota Vikings player. Props have to go to Hutchinson for this one as well, who takes the stomach breaker, belly to back suplex, and camel clutch really well. Perhaps he was the Dolph Ziggler of 80s jobbers. This is catastrophically short, but it's certainly much more entertaining than Ventura and Curtis, and therefore from me it gets 1.5 stars. And then Vince introduces us straight into match 4, which is your main event of the evening, which incredibly is Big John Studd against Bobo Brazil. We've got another change in location here, made even more obvious by the giant Spectrum logo in the centre of the ring. And yes, this is your main event, introduced by Mel Phillips, who obviously doesn't have a Wikipedia page, who also has a questionable sexual past, to say the least. Yes, we've got paedophilia and racism on the show now. It just shows really how shit this whole thing has been. Studd steals the mic from Phillips to try and sell himself as over 7 feet, despite the fact he's 6'10", and over 400 pounds, despite the fact he's in the nearly 300 pounds, should I say, despite nearly 400 pounds, despite the fact he's actually nearer the I think the 350 mark, and he calls himself in a totally asexual manner the Giant Stud. So Bobo Brazil here is 50, I think, and he's on the comeback trail. He looks barely able to move sufficiently, and basically the match starts with the two bear hugging for ages before Bobo puts in some nicely stylized headbutts and a decent corner head scissors, defying his age and looks, actually. The rest of the match is basically horrible, with slow shoulder block tackles and a clunky leg drop from Bobo to set up Studd's finishing elbow drop. Yes, a standing elbow drop for the 3. Studd once again tells us how giant he is, and this is essentially another squash match, despite Bobo's big appeal and reputation. And yeah, it's absolutely terrible bar a couple of Bobo's headbutts and his nice leg scissors. And so for this match, I have to give it 1.5 stars. Sorry, Bobo. Then we cut to another advert on the 24/7 version for WWF Magazine. It's exactly the same advert as before, and it just to rub salt into our already considerable and justified wounds, to be honest. Not on the 24/7 on demand version is an interview with Paul Orndorff, and he's interviewed by Mean Gene again. Mr. Wonderful discusses his flowing locks and how this has led to a direct doubling of divorce rates. And that's basically the end of the wrestling relation things on the show. So yeah, basically what utter shite, to be honest. Vince signs off. He's still got his Vincent Kennedy McMahon, damn it, smirk going on. Vince says goodbye with a bemused-looking Freddie Miller with the promise of Hulk Hogan, all 6'8" and 300 pounds of him on the next show. God help us. And yeah, that's the end of the show with the rather trashy 80s music at the end. So basically to conclude, the first match I have to say is passable and is a decent jobbing match, but the rest is just an embarrassing and uncomfortable watch. All I can say is Black Saturday indeed. The average rating for this one, rounded up or down to the nearest 0.5, is 1.5 stars out of 5. Probably the worst wrestling show I've ever watched, and I have sat through ECW December to Dismember. So I'll just give you a little bit of aftermath to what took place after this. Obviously, the show was a disaster. Thousands of angry fans called in to complain about the loss of top talent they were used to seeing. Vince, like always, believed fans just needed time to get the product. Wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong, Vince. So Ted Turner brought back GCW for Saturday mornings and also invested in Bill Watts Mid-South Wrestling for Sundays. Vince was furious with Ted for this and put no new matches on his show, just showing house show matches and tapings, and eventually selling off his interest after a disastrous brief run. But this moment is, of course, important because it sowed the seed for the long-time Vince and Ted rivalry that would culminate in the Monday Night Wars. So yeah, that was basically the pilot episode for the WrestleReview. We've just covered their Black Saturday from July of 1984. All I could say is, thanks for listening in to this edition of the WrestleReview podcast. Like and subscribe if you're tuning in from YouTube. Repost and share on SoundCloud. And please send your feedback to the email address WrestleReviewFans@gmail.com. Thanks once again, and I'll see you next time for a review of the inaugural WrestleMania event. It promises to be ever so slightly better than the absolute clusterfuck that I've just reviewed. Thank you very much. I've been Nathan Packham. This has been WrestleReview. See you next time, wrestling fans.